Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to The Money Factor, the program that focuses on local business and personal finance topics. I'm Richard Naylor, your host. Balancing the interest of the individual, their neighbors, and the community when it's an issue of building codes is always a work in progress. Our guest today is Mike Rosch from the Colonie Building Department to help us better understand the process and the issues. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Richard.
Mike, as department head in the business department, you oversee a lot of important issues in the town. But could you give us an overview first of what the building department does?
Well, the building department is responsible for the enforcement of the New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, which encompasses a bunch of codes like the residential code, the building code for commercial use, property maintenance code, plumbing, electric code. And so people come into our office to learn about the codes, and we assist them in learning about the codes so that when they make application for building permits, they know what they're doing. We also enforce and assist residents with and business people with our zoning law, which is a very complicated law in my opinion, and to help them understand it so when they're building a project that they also conform with the zoning law. We also enforce the sign law from the town of Colonie and helping business people with signs that identify their parcels and their business. And we do some other miscellaneous things like we do mobile home inspections, mobile home park inspections. We do junkyards. We inspect junkyards on an annual basis. We also do billboard inspections annually. Billboards have to renew their permits annually, so that's about what we do.
That's a lot.
That is a lot, and keeps us very busy. It's the town is booming. It has been for many years, and so it keeps us very busy.
What brought you to the building department?
Well, that's an interesting question. I started out working in the family business when I first started after getting out of the service in 1971, and worked there for a while. I left to go with another company, part of another family business, but not my family. And then I came back to my family business and worked as the president of the company for a while. And then the job in the building department opened up. And at that point in my life, I think I was ready to, let's say, go a different direction than working in a construction company. And so I applied as director of the building department and was fortunate enough to be successful in getting the position.
Well, that's always good when someone has experience from the other side, so to speak.
Yes, I think that it's important for the director of the building department to at least be a little bit familiar with the other side of the coin. When someone comes into the department looking for a permit, they understand where that person is coming from.
And it's their life and it's their living, and so you really have to be sensitive to that.
That's correct.
One of the things that people have to do is to get a permit, and permits are a fact of life. Whenever you want to build something, you want to change something, you want to put up a sign. So maybe a good place to start would be, when does someone call the building department, excuse me, and what triggers that? When should they call, and what's the process then that would take place?
Well, the process is a little bit different for commercial than residential. The commercial building permit process is a little bit more complicated because the projects are a little bit more complicated. Residential permits could vary anywhere from installing a shed in your rear yard to putting a second second-story addition on your house, so they become a little bit more complicated even in residential. On our webpage, there is a frequently asked question of when you do need a building permit, and in almost all cases you do need building permits for almost anything. Certain things don't need permits, such as fences, or if you're going to put a swing set in your yard, something like this. But almost everything you do in your house would almost require a building permit.
So it's probably a good idea to call the building department, even if you think you don't need a permit, because what if you wanted to build a 20-foot fence, for example? Could you do that?
We do not regulate fences in the
Really?
town of
Not at all?
Colonie. We get asked that question quite frequently. Do I need a building permit for a fence? Because some municipalities do require permits, and in certain cases where you put that fence is regulated by their fence regulations. So they're familiar that in other municipalities they regulate fencing. We don't. 20-foot high fence obviously is very tall.
Right.
The normal question we get asked is, how high a fence can I put up? And when we tell them that there are no restrictions on fence heights, the normal response is, well, could I put up a 12-foot fence?
Really?
Which,
That's high as well.
that is very high. And we say, if that's what you would like to do, there are no restrictions. I have never yet seen a fence go higher than 8 feet, though, in the town. So
Right. Maybe they didn't really realize how tall that was.
an 8-foot fence is very, very high. A 6-foot fence, I believe, is high. And,
Right.
So, yeah, I think people, when they're looking for privacy, maybe they had an issue with their neighbor. They're looking to put up something that would restrict the view from their neighbor to them, or vice versa, and they don't realize how high an 8-foot fence is.
Right. So I guess the only thing with fences that we've seen is that if you have a swimming pool, you may need a fence. And other than that, you can put up a fence anytime you want.
That's correct. There is some restrictions about putting it in the front yard if it blocks the view of traffic coming down the street, so that when your neighbor is backing out of their driveway, they have to be able to see both ways, to see traffic coming. But we do not regulate that. The police department does.
Is there anything else with a residential permit that people should keep in mind?
A lot of people think that a permit is not required for a prefabricated shed, so that if they ordered it from a lumber yard or someone else that does prefabricated sheds, they feel they do not need a permit. They do need a permit. Mostly we look at it for zoning purposes to make sure that the shed is not put too close to your neighbor's property. There are zoning restrictions of how close it can be placed to a property line.
And probably not in the front yard?
Sheds are not permitted in the front yard. They are permitted in the side yard, which the side yard setbacks are normally a little bit more restrictive. In the rear yard, they could go up to 5 foot from the side yard and the rear yard property
Okay.
line.
So obviously if they're putting on a second story or something, they need a permit. Maybe we move now to the business side, which is more complicated, as you said.
The commercial building permits are a little bit more complicated. The residential permit application is a one-step process,
Okay.
where it's a building and zoning permit, and we look at the application to make sure that it complies not only with our zoning law, but also with the residential code of New York State. The commercial permits, it's a 3-step process where they would come in and file for a commercial zoning verification, and then we would review it to make sure it complies with our zoning law. When we do that, after we approve that commercial zoning verification application, then it would go on to the planning department for their planning review, which for some projects could be very lengthy, well over a year in some cases. And then once they have their planning board approval, then they would come back to us for their building permit. And they would have to come in with their plans, and then we would review their plans to make sure that it complies with the building code of New York State. And then once it does, then we would issue the permit at that time.
So the first step would involve whether you can build the kind of thing that you want to build in that place.
That's correct. We would look at what kind of a use you want to make on your parcel, and we look at where the parcel is located to make sure it's in the zoning district that permits that type of a use, and then make sure that the structure, any structure that you're going to put on the site complies with all of the setbacks and the height.
And then the second step, which involves the planning board. Now, what do they look at?
The planning board looks at things like traffic flow, parking, green space, your landscaping. They look at everything outside the building, and we look at the building and everything inside.
I see. So then the third step would be, is the building built according to code?
That's correct.
Now, I mentioned the word code, and we had a little conversation before the show started about the origin of the code. I'd kind of like to go back over that because I thought it was interesting. I always wondered where these rules come from.
Okay, well, the building code comes from New York State. The Department of State in New York State is responsible to publish the code and to ensure that municipalities are adopting the code correctly. As we went back in a little historical view, the code that New York State had prior to 2003 was a code that only New York State had. Even the city didn't have the same code that the rest of the state had. Then in the early 2000s, the states in the United States started getting together. There was 3 model codes at that time. There was one in northeastern United States that a lot of the New England states had, but not New York State. There was the southern states that had a different code, and then out west they had another code. Those 3 model code groups got together to form, or let's say to publish, an international code. At that time, New York State decided that they would adopt the international code. So at this point, we are in with a bunch of other states in the United States, almost all of them. I'm not sure if anyone has their own code at this point. New York City is still using their own code, although there is movement down in the city for them to adopt the international code also. We found that in New York State, having our own code to try to update it, keep it current, keep all of our reference standards up to date was a big job. And I think the Department of State, much to their own credit, finally listened to the building officials in New York State and said, hey, we need to have a code that is updated, it's fresh, it's current, the reference standards are up to date. In some cases, like when I say a reference standard, like the National Electric Code is a reference standard that we would use to go and look at when someone's doing electric work, because electric work isn't necessarily covered that well in the building code.
And is that part of the same code? Did that come also from the international code?
No, that's separate. That
Okay.
comes from a different association, and it's widely used throughout the United States. But as I say, the current National Electric Code that we had before 2003, I believe was 1996 National Electric Code, and that is updated every year.
Okay.
And it for New York State to adopt a code and keep it current takes action by the Code Council of New York State, which is a lengthy process. So to try to update the codes and keep them current was a big job. And they found out it was easier just to adopt the international code. But they have done it with some enhancements, and they deleted some things out of the international code they didn't feel was appropriate to New York State.
Well, it does seem to simplify things. If you're coming from another state or moving to another state, you don't have to learn a complete new set of rules.
Well, as you know, the commercial development in Colonie still is very, very hectic. And there are a lot of projects that come in where they have out-of-state architects. In order for an architect to stamp drawings in New York State, they have to be licensed by New York State, but they are still out-of-state architects that are licensed in New York State. And so now for them to come into New York State makes it much easier for them, because the code that they're using in New York State is probably very similar to the one they're using wherever they are.
That's good.
It is good.
Now, are there differences, local differences as well? We used to have a blue book. I know we still have that. But are there any building code issues in that town code?
There are none.
So everything that we do in building code is really from the more general code?
Well, and it always was.
Oh, okay.
And some people think that we have our own building code in Colonie, and we don't. In order for us to adopt standards different than the building code, takes action by the Department of State. we would have to have a more restrictive code, let's say, than New York State has. And in order for us to do that, the Codes Council from New York State would have to approve those. And you have to prove to them that your municipality is so unique, so therefore you need these more restrictive standards. And some municipalities have done that, but the town of Colonie has none that are different than New York State.
Well, that helped me understand a little better, because it does, now I get the idea that it's the state that really, and I think you said that right in the beginning, it's the state that creates the building code.
That's correct. And
Or they adopt another one.
That's correct. And a lot of people come in and say, you know, it's the town of Colonie building code. We do not have our own building code. No municipality in New York State outside of the city has one.
Are there any other issues with the building code in general before we move on to another part of what you do that you would like to cover?
One of the things that is sometimes not very well known in the business community is that we do require building permits for a change of tenant in a commercial building. So that if you are let's say you are an owner of an office building and you have maybe 11 office tenants, for example, and one of them leaves because their lease is up and they've decided either to go out of business or move to a different location because they need more room and you cannot give them more room. So you lease that space to another tenant. That does require a building permit, and most building owners now in town of Colonie understand that, but there are still some out there that don't understand that a building permit is required, even though no work is being done. Merely the fact that they're changing a tenant. And that is in our local zoning law, that does require a building permit. And why we do that, and I shouldn't say we do that, because the building department doesn't make these zoning laws, the town board does.
Right.
But the reason the town board adopted this regulation is that it gives us a chance to go in and inspect that space in between tenants to make sure that no work has been done that doesn't comply with the code, that the exiting is still safe. And let's say if it's a sprinklered building, the sprinklers are still up to date, the fire alarms still work. And so we use that to do an inspection before we'll issue another certificate of occupancy to the new tenant.
Now I want to backtrack just a second, because that kind of rang a bell in my case, and maybe the fire alarm was part of that. But in terms of residents or businesses, are there any new things that people should be aware of with fire alarms, smoke detectors, carbon monoxide alarms, whatever?
Well, there is some differences since 2003 as far as smoke detectors in residential dwelling units. Carbon monoxide detectors need to be installed when a house is sold. Okay, so if you're living in a house that you've lived in for years and years, there is no requirement to put a carbon monoxide detector in. But if the house goes for sale and a new owner comes in, there has to be a carbon monoxide detector installed. There is a regulation in the new building code that when a permit is issued for some work to be done in your dwelling unit, smoke detectors have to be brought up to the new standard, which means that a smoke detector has to be installed in every bedroom, outside of every sleeping area, and on every floor level. And sometimes we would issue a permit, let's say for example a wood stove insert. I'm sorry, not a wood stove insert, but let's say a gas insert in your fireplace. Because the triggering action is the issuance of a permit, you would be required to update your smoke detectors in your house.
Now, I don't know why anybody wouldn't want their smoke detectors to work in their house, but that's good to know that you need to think about that when you're selling your house.
Most people do not have a problem updating their smoke detectors or installing a carbon monoxide detector, but you'd be surprised that some people object to that.
I am surprised. Another issue in terms of emergency services, I just was thinking about the house numbers. I noticed on your website that there was some mention of house numbers, and when does that come into play? That I know that the emergency services really need to be able to find a home if that home is calling a 911. And when you give them your address, they want to know which house that is. And I've been down streets trying to find houses once in a while to visit someone, and I can't find a number.
House numbers are required in at least 3 different places in the new code. It's in the Residential Code of New York State. I know it's in the Building Code of New York State. It's in the Fire Code of New York State, and I believe it's also in the Property Maintenance Code, that house numbers need to be placed either on the house or a place visible from the street for emergency services. The numbers need to be 4-inch high, minimum 4-inch high with a half-inch stroke. This is one of the very few retroactive requirements in the code, so that every house, every commercial building in the town needs to have this identification. Now, as you say, you know that that's not happening at this point. When we issue a permit for renovation work, or alteration work, additions, one of our requirements is that they put the house number on their house. We have not gone down into neighborhoods or commercial establishments and tell them that, hey, where's your house, where's your identification, you need to have this installed so that you're in compliance. We have not done that yet. We just don't have the people to do that, but it is a requirement that they have that on there.
And probably the more times this is said, the better. I generally think people don't do something like that because they don't get around to it.
They either don't get around to it. I mean, it has not been promulgated very well by the state or from us that this is a requirement that they have to comply with right now.
Well, there it is. So let's move on to the sign law. This is a very contentious area with businesses, and it's a little like a house number, but now it's got a name on it. Tell us in general a little bit about the sign law.
Well, the sign law was established by the town a long time ago. I'm not sure exactly what the date was, but basically to regulate signage in the town. The town did not want to have a proliferation of signs that detracted from the beauty of the town. The intent of the sign law is that every parcel should have the identification so that the traveling public trying to find the parcel that they're looking for, it's easy. And not only the parcel, but once they're on the parcel, that they can find the tenant on that parcel that they're looking for. So that every parcel, every commercial parcel is allowed to have a freestanding sign that identifies the parcel. And then every tenant who has direct customer access to the out of doors is allowed to have a sign over their entrance door. That's how the sign law works. And then also in the sign law, there's established what's called the Sign Review Board to hear appeals from the sign law to grant relief in special cases where the sign law may not work for that particular case. And the Sign Review Board meets first and third Tuesdays of the month at the Public Operations Center, and the calendar is normally always full from business owners who want to come in and either have more signs than the law allows or a different sign than the law allows. The law is fairly simple on what it allows, and it's not a lot of signage that's allowed. And a lot of businesses, especially retail, like to have more signage, especially if they're a national chain, and in other municipalities, they're given much more freedom for signage.
Now, how does that work? You mean in other localities?
Well, I'm talking about, let's say, in other states, they may have a different sign law, and they're allowed to have a larger sign, higher sign that could be seen maybe from the interstate, whereas the town of Colonie kind of frowns on that, because if you cannot gain access to the parcel from the interstate, then it really doesn't help the traveling public find your parcel.
Right.
So, and we really don't look at signs for advertising purposes. It's really for the ease of people to find your parcel.
Of course, a business does look at it for advertising purposes, so I guess that's the source of some of the conflict.
Of course. And the sign law does not regulate content of the sign. So in addition to identifying the parcel, they're allowed to put whatever will fit in that square footage. So if they want to tell you exactly what they do inside their building, like CVS advertises some of their services on their freestanding signs. Sometimes the drugstores, they do want extra signs to show that they do have food in there. They have 24-hour photo service, whatever other services. These signs are customarily not granted by the sign review board as helping people get to the
So
to
it
that
sounds
parcel.
like appeals that would have a better chance of success have to do with the purpose of the law, and that is to help people find the business. So if maybe the business was farther away or hidden in some way, that's where the review board might look at that more closely.
That's correct. That's correct. We had a sign review board meeting last night. One of the applicants was a business on Loudon Road that had 4 tenants in their building. By definition, the sign law says that that's a commercial complex. The parcel may be identified, but not any of the individual tenants on the freestanding sign. The sign review board heard the appeal and felt that there was a special circumstance for this particular business, that one of the tenants at least could have a sign over the door, which would be permitted by our sign law. So they granted them a freestanding sign with 3 tenants on their sign, so that the tenants that are, let's say, around the back, that you may not see the wall sign, you would be able to see the wall sign and know that on the freestanding sign the other tenants are also on that parcel.
Great. So that is a little encouraging for people who have a problem with their sign and simply can't be found easily. Could you
Right.
describe the process of going about getting yourself a sign?
There's a special application that you can find on our webpage. It's a sign permit application. There's 2 sets of plans that are required, showing the location of the sign and a picture of the sign, what it looks like. If it's a freestanding sign, we want to see what the foundation is. The sign has to be able to withstand the wind loading by New York State code. So you have to show us the location of the sign, you have to show us what the sign looks like, you have to show us all the setbacks, because there are regulations on how close a sign can be to the road, to the side property line. Most signs are illuminated, so they can be seen at night. There is no regulation on illumination. And once we receive the application and the plans, if it's a freestanding sign, meaning it's not placed on the wall of the building, we have to do some checking to make sure it's not in any easements, that there's no water easement, no pipe that you're going to put this sign on. So we would send it over to the Department of Public Works for their review, make sure it's not in an easement. And the sign applications are normally reviewed fairly quickly, and we can get those out within the week that we receive them, as long as everything complies. If it's an electric sign, they need to give us a UL number, make sure that it's Underwriter Laboratories inspected. So
that's pretty quick.
it is quick.
Right.
It is quick. We have one person in our office whose responsibility is signs. That's not all he does, but that's what he does, and it keeps him busy, probably at least a half a day every day doing signs.
We're almost out of time, and I want to just see if there's something we didn't cover that you wish people knew that perhaps some don't.
Well, I'm not sure if there's. I can't think of anything that I can think of that people should know that I failed to cover. What I would like to say, though, is that the building department is a service department, that we are here to help the people who live and work in the town of Colonie, and that they shouldn't be afraid to call. If they want to email us.
We can put that up on the screen. You can give both of those, the email and the website and the phone number.
Sure. I mean, we've got Mary Brazell, Town Supervisor, has made it so that every department can be contacted by email. And there's one computer in every department that if you send it just to that department, one person is going to get it and be responsible to respond. I'm that person in the building department, so if you just put it to colonie.org, it'll come to me, to my computer, and I will answer it hopefully within the same day that I get it. If not, call me on the phone and yell at me and say, hey, how come I sent you an email and you didn't respond?
What was the number there?
The phone number is 783-2706.
And I could probably tell them the website also, www.colonie.org/business. Building.
/building.
Second time I've done that.
/building. Or if you don't put /building on, you'll come to the home page and just hit department and then hit building.
And they'll find your email there as well.
And they'll find the email there, right.
I think we could go on another half hour, but the show is pretty much to the end. I want to thank you for being on the show. I think it's been interesting, and I hope people did enjoy that.
Well, you're welcome, and if anyone has any questions after that, feel free just to call or email.
And I want to thank you for watching and invite you to next week's show, and hope you have a great week. Take care.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.